The gavel came down hard. Order! Alessia Vasquez was already on her feet, moving with the kind of precision that made other lawyers nervous just watching her. She didn't pace. She didn't gesture dramatically. She walked to the center of that courtroom like she owned every inch of it, placed both hands flat on the prosecution table, and let the silence do the work before she even opened her mouth. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, almost quiet. "The defense would have this court believe that Dominic Varela is simply a successful businessman, a philanthropist, a man unfairly targeted by overzealous prosecutors." She paused, let her eyes sweep across the jury. "So let's talk about what a successful businessman actually looks like." She turned toward the projector. A single click. Financial records filled the screen. Wire transfers? Shell companies, ghost subsidiaries layered like Russian nesting dolls. 17 offshore accounts, 9 shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, a paper trail so meticulously constructed that on the surface, it looks completely clean. Another click. Until you pull the thread. The screen shifted. Red lines connected names, dates, account numbers. A web. A very deliberate, very intentional web. Then it unravels rather quickly. The courtroom shifted. Jurors leaned forward. The defense team exchanged tense glances. A young attorney whispered something urgent to the man beside him, but Dominic Varela didn't move. He sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, one arm resting across the back of his chair, the portrait of absolute ease. He wasn't watching the screen. He wasn't watching his legal team scramble. He was watching her. Alessia felt it before she turned. That particular weight of a gaze that isn't just looking, it's evaluating. She'd felt it from witnesses trying to intimidate her. She'd felt it from defense attorneys trying to rattle her. She turned anyway, because she never backed down from a stare in her life. Their eyes met. Dominic Varela tilted his head, barely, just a fraction, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a performance for the jury. It was private, meant only for her, like he was enjoying something she wasn't in on yet. Alessia held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the jury without blinking. Inside, something she refused to name shifted in her chest. She pressed on. "The prosecution will demonstrate, clearly and methodically, that the defendant used legitimate business structures to launder over $40 million in criminal proceeds over a period of 4 years. We will show you the money trail. We will show you the witnesses, and we will show you exactly who Dominic Varela is, beneath the suit, beneath the philanthropy, beneath the carefully constructed image." She straightened. "The truth, ladies and gentlemen, does not bend. It does not disappear. And it certainly does not smile." She sat down. And she did not look at him again. But she heard it. The quietest exhale from the defense table. Almost like a laugh. Almost like something impressed. What Alessia didn't know was that Dominic Varela had already seen the one secret that could destroy her, and he'd been deciding for weeks exactly what to do with it. Alessia Vasquez had never lost a case. Not a single one. In 9 years as a federal prosecutor, she had a conviction rate that made senior partners at private firms quietly furious and young law graduates privately devoted. She didn't take cases she couldn't win. More precisely, she didn't accept the premise that any case was unwinnable, only that some required more preparation than others. She was 34 years old and looked exactly like someone who had spent those years becoming very, very good at one thing. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that cataloged everything they touched, hair pulled back so tight it seemed like a physical philosophy. She didn't do soft. Soft was for people who could afford mistakes. Her father had understood that. Rafael Vasquez had been a man of rules. Every morning before school, posture, preparation, purpose, 3 Ps. He'd been a city official for 22 years, a man who believed, without irony or wavering, that the law was the last honest thing in a dishonest world. Alessia had inherited that belief like bone structure, It was just part of what she was made of. She'd become a prosecutor because defense attorneys made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate, a feeling like watching someone argue that gravity was optional. The law was the law. It existed for a reason. Her job was to enforce it. When Chief Prosecutor Marcus Hale called her into his office on a Tuesday morning 3 months ago and slid a manila folder across his desk with the name Varela stamped in red across the top, she hadn't hesitated for even a moment. "Dominic Varela," Marcus said, leaning back with the measured gravity he deployed whenever he wanted to signal significance. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, a man who had built a career on knowing exactly which cases to touch and which to leave alone. The Varela case: money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy. We've been building this for 2 years. I want you on it, Alessia. She picked up the folder and opened it. His organization is careful, Marcus continued. He's beaten 3 prior investigations. The man is intelligent, connected, and extraordinarily patient. He will come at you sideways before he comes at you directly. Alessia turned a page. Photographs, surveillance, financial records. She felt the familiar click inside her, the one that happened when a case had enough substance to bite into. "I'll take it," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "I knew you would." He paused. "Be careful with this one, Alessia. Varela operates in circles where the law is a suggestion." She set the folder down. "The law is never a suggestion." Marcus held her gaze for a moment longer than she expected. Then he smiled. "No?" he said. "I suppose not." She left his office with the file under her arm and spent the next 6 weeks learning everything there was to know about Dominic Varela. She read his financials until she could recite his account numbers in her sleep. She studied his corporate structure, his public appearances, his charitable donations, because she knew that men like him built their public image the way other people built walls, high enough to keep the questions out. What she couldn't find was the crack. Not yet, but she would. Dominic Varela had been untouchable for so long that the concept of vulnerability had become almost theoretical to him. He was 41 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing an existence that existed simultaneously on 2 planes, the legitimate and the invisible. The legitimate plane was immaculate. The Varela Group: real estate, private equity, logistics infrastructure across 3 continents. His name on hospital wings and scholarship funds, and the kind of charity galas that politicians attended to be photographed with people wealthier than themselves. The other plane was the one that made the legitimate plane possible. He'd inherited neither his money nor his network. He'd built both carefully from a position of having absolutely nothing, starting at 19 in a city that ate ambitious young men for sport. He'd learned early that power was not a destination. It was a constant state of maintenance. You protected it every single day, or you didn't have it anymore. The people who feared him, and there were many, feared him primarily because he was never reactive. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't make examples of people in ways that drew attention. He thought 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room and let them tire themselves out chasing the version of him they imagined, while the real version was already somewhere else entirely. He'd heard about Alessia Vasquez before she was officially assigned to his case. He had people inside the federal building whose entire function was to listen for exactly these kinds of developments. When the name came to him, Vasquez, an undefeated record, Hale's top prosecutor. He'd done what he always did. He started learning. He read her case files. He studied her methods, the way she built arguments from the outermost evidence inward, creating a tightening circle until there was nowhere left for a defendant to stand. He watched footage from her previous trials. He noted the stillness she deployed like a weapon, the way she constructed silence as pressure. He found her interesting in a way he hadn't anticipated. And then, his team flagged something else. Something in the Vasquez background that hadn't made it into any official record. Something buried so deep it would have taken exactly the kind of people he employed to find it. He read that file twice. Then he sat alone in his office for a long moment, looking at the city through floor-to-ceiling glass, and thought about what he was going to do with it. He decided to wait, to watch, to learn more before he made any move at all. When he walked into that courtroom on the first day and saw her standing there, poised and precise and absolutely certain, something shifted in his assessment. He'd been expecting formidable. He hadn't been expecting this. The stillness wasn't performance. It was architecture. She'd built herself into someone who didn't flinch. He found that, against his better judgment, genuinely compelling. He sat down. He watched her work. He smiled. And he started to wonder if there was a version of this that didn't end the way he'd initially planned. The first time they spoke privately, it was in the marble corridor outside Courtroom 7, 3 days into the trial. Alessia had just finished dismantling the defense's first witness, a financial consultant named Pratt, who'd arrived on the stand with careful confidence and departed from it visibly shaken, having been walked through his own testimony, contradiction by contradiction, until the jury was no longer looking at him at all. She'd been measured, courteous, and absolutely devastating. She was gathering her files from the prosecution table when she became aware that Dominic had stopped beside her. She didn't look up immediately. She finished stacking her files. Then she looked up. "Counselor," he said, even though she wasn't his counsel. He said it like a title that meant something else. "Mr. Varela." She matched his tone with steel. "So you should be speaking with your attorneys." "I speak with my attorneys constantly." He studied her with those dark, unhurried eyes. "I thought I might speak with the opposing party for a change." "That's not how trials work." "Most things don't work the way they're supposed to." He tilted his head slightly. "You were excellent in there, with Pratt. He came in intending to hold his ground, and you had him questioning his own name by the end." She looked at him evenly. "Flattery from the defendant doesn't change my case strategy." "It wasn't flattery." His voice didn't waver. "I was making an observation. I find competence worth acknowledging, regardless of which side of the room it's on." "I'm going to put you in prison, Mr. Varela." He seemed to consider this. That's a very confident position for someone who's been losing evidence at a rather consistent rate. Something cold moved through her chest. Because he was right. 3 pieces of documentation had gone missing from secured storage in the past 2 weeks. She'd buried that anxiety under meticulous reconstruction, but she hadn't told anyone how much it had unsettled her. That he knew told her something she needed to understand better. "Every prosecutor faces procedural obstacles," she said carefully. "Of course." He held her gaze. "I'd just hate to see someone of your caliber caught off guard." A pause. "That's all." He turned and walked away, unhurried, flanked by the 2 attorneys who'd been hovering at a respectful distance. Alessia watched him go. Her jaw was tight. Her mind was already working, pulling at the thread he'd just dropped. She was not going to be caught off guard. She went back to her office and stood at her window for a full 10 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than she usually allowed herself to stand anywhere without purpose. The city ran its usual noise below her. Inside the building, phones rang, doors opened and closed. The machinery of law enforcement processed its endless caseload. She thought about his eyes. Not the way she would have admitted thinking about anyone's eyes. Not with any softness, but analytically. Because the eyes were the part that didn't match the file. The file described a man who used people, who operated from behind layers of insulation, who had never once in his life been careless enough to be caught. The file described someone who felt nothing he didn't want to feel, and showed nothing he didn't choose to show. But there was something in those eyes, when he'd looked at her across the courtroom, that the file couldn't account for. Something that was, she thought with profound irritation, genuine. She didn't trust genuine things when they came from people she was prosecuting. She sat down and opened her files and got back to work. But the thread he'd dropped about the evidence, The precision of that knowledge stayed with her the way a splinter stays under skin. Invisible but constant. The next 3 weeks were a particular kind of chess match that Alessia had never played before. She built her case in layers, say the way her instincts told her to, financial records anchored to witness testimony, anchored to corporate documents, anchored to digital forensics. A cathedral of evidence. The problem was that the cathedral kept losing bricks. A witness who had been fully cooperative suddenly found a reason to recant. A document that had been authenticated disappeared from the chain of evidence. An expert she'd retained for 6 months called to withdraw, citing unspecified concerns about the engagement. Each loss was individually explainable. Collectively, they formed a pattern that made her skin go cold at 3 in the morning when she was working alone in her apartment. Files spread across every surface. Someone was inside her case. She didn't tell Marcus. Something about the way he'd looked at her in that initial meeting, something she hadn't been able to name at the time, made her pause before trusting this instinct to him. Instead, she started working a secondary thread, quiet, documented only in a personal notebook that never left her possession. Meanwhile, Dominic Varela appeared. Not in any threatening or obvious way. He appeared the way a man appears, when he is very good at being somewhere without calling attention to the fact that it is deliberate. She ran into him at a charity auction for a children's hospital. He was one of the headline donors. She was there because a colleague had dragged her, and she'd thought 3 hours away from her files might clear her head. He was across the room, and he caught her eye once, and she looked away first, and she was angry at herself for it. She saw him again at a judicial conference. He wasn't a lawyer, but he sat on the board of a legal reform foundation and attended as a stakeholder. He was 3 tables away at dinner. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. She felt the awareness of him like weather. A week later, he was in the lobby of a building where she had a meeting with an FBI liaison. She walked past him without speaking. He said quietly, as she passed, "The Marchetti filing. Check the date stamp." She didn't stop walking. That night, she checked the Marchetti filing, a corporate document she'd flagged 3 weeks ago, and then filed away. The date stamp had been altered, subtly, barely perceptible, but enough to make it inadmissible if anyone looked closely in court. She caught it. She sent the original for forensic analysis and began reconstructing from a different angle. She didn't understand why he'd told her. She didn't understand it at all, and that bothered her more than the tampered document. On a wet Thursday evening, after a particularly brutal 6-hour court session, Alessia found herself sitting at a bar she didn't usually frequent because she'd taken a wrong turn leaving a parking garage, and the rain had made that decision for her. She ordered coffee. She opened her notebook. She was so deep in her own thoughts that she didn't notice the man who sat 2 stools down until he ordered whiskey, neat, and she recognized the voice. She looked up. Dominic Varela looked slightly less composed than she'd ever seen him. His jacket over the back of the stool, his collar loosened by 1 button, his expression carrying something that looked almost like fatigue. "Of all the bars," she said. "I know the owner." He glanced at her notebook. "Long day." "Every day on this case is long." She considered leaving. She stayed. "You look tired." He looked at her with something like surprise, like he hadn't expected the observation. "I am tired," he said, as if trying out the honesty. "I don't usually say that." "I don't imagine you usually say a lot of things." He was quiet for a moment. The bar murmured around them. Rain touched the windows. "Why did you become a prosecutor?" he asked. Not like small talk, like he actually wanted to know. "Because the law is the only honest system we have." "You believe that?" "Yes." "That's not naive," he said carefully. "I want to be clear. I'm not calling it naive. I'm saying that in my experience, the law and justice are not always the same thing, and most people who work in the law know that and choose which one to serve." "I serve both." "Do you?" He turned his glass slowly in his hands. "Or do you serve the structure? because the structure is what your father taught you to believe in. She went very still. The precision of that landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for. My father, she said, her voice quiet and controlled, is not a subject I'll discuss with you. He looked at her steadily. I'm not attacking him. I'm asking a question about what drives you. There's a difference. There isn't a difference when you're the man I'm prosecuting. He accepted that. He looked away. Fair enough. He finished his whiskey. For what it's worth. And I understand it isn't worth much. Date coming from me. I think your instincts about this case are correct. You're right that something is wrong. You're wrong about what it is. She stared at him. That's a remarkable thing to say to the woman building your prosecution. Yes, he agreed. It is. He put money on the bar, picked up his jacket, and left. She sat for a long time after, rain against the glass, her notebook open to a page she hadn't written on. The thing that broke something in her assessment of him happened on a Sunday morning, when she wasn't looking for it. She'd been following a secondary thread, a pattern of community transactions she'd found buried in the corporate records, money moving through a foundation she'd flagged as potentially a laundering vehicle. She'd staked out the foundation's address with a colleague who owed her a favor, camera ready, and expecting to document a meeting that would give her another chain of evidence. What she documented instead was Dominic Varela arriving on foot, alone, no security, carrying 2 bags from a pharmacy. He buzzed the door of the connected building, a residential building she hadn't realized shared the address. A woman in her 50s opened the door, a teenager behind her. The conversation she captured on a directional mic was not about money. It was about medication costs. The woman's husband was 3 months into cancer treatment, and they'd hit the coverage limit on their insurance. She was trying to decide between his prescriptions and the electricity bill. Dominic didn't make a speech. He didn't produce paperwork. He handed her the pharmacy bags and said quietly that the coverage issue had been resolved, that the bills would route through the foundation's medical assistance fund, that she didn't need to worry about it, and that she should call if anything else came up. The woman cried. The teenager hugged him. He was awkward about it in a way that seemed genuine, like someone who did things because they needed to be done, not because he needed to be seen doing them. He left. Still alone. Still on foot. Alessia sat in the car for a long time. That doesn't change the financials, her colleague said. No, she agreed. A criminal can be kind to individuals and still be a criminal. I know that. So. She started the car. I know that. But something had cracked in the certainty she'd carried for 3 months. Not the legal certainty. The evidence was the evidence. The other certainty. The one about who he was as a person. That particular clean line had gotten complicated, and she hated complicated. They had their most honest conversation 2 days later. He'd requested a meeting, formally, through his legal team, phrased as an opportunity to discuss potential case resolution. It was a reasonable request. She agreed to 15 minutes in a conference room with both legal teams present. His team left after 5 minutes when he quietly asked them to. Hers hesitated. Alessia nodded, and they went. You saw me Sunday, he said. It wasn't a question. I was surveilling the foundation address. I know. He wasn't angry. I'm not going to tell you that what you do outside this building changes anything. I understand your job. Then why ask for this meeting? Because I think you're in danger, he said. And I don't mean from me. She kept her face composed. Explain that. The evidence you've been losing. The witnesses who've retracted. Someone is managing your case from the inside, Alessia. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She didn't correct him. Not to protect me, to use your investigation as a vehicle, to get close to my operation using the legitimacy of a federal case. Someone is using you. She looked at him across the table. And you're telling me this because I would rather be in a position to defend myself in a court of law than be dismantled by someone who isn't bound by any law at all. He held her gaze. My organization is not what you think it is. It is not clean. I will not pretend otherwise. But there are people who want what I've built, and they are not constrained by the kind of rules that even I operate within. Who? He was quiet for a moment. She then. Someone you trust. The room felt smaller suddenly. Give me a name. Not yet, because once I give you a name, I lose the only thing keeping me useful to you. She stared at him. This is a game. No. He met her eyes. I have been playing games for 20 years, Alessia. I know what they feel like. This is not one of them. She left without giving him anything, but she went back to her personal notebook that night and started a new page. At the top, she wrote one word. Who? The answer came to her not from Dominic, but from her own obsessive documentation. She'd been cross-referencing her case timeline. Every piece of lost evidence, every retracted witness, every procedural setback, against the access logs for the secured case system. It was tedious work, the kind that rewarded the kind of patience she'd cultivated over 9 years. She found it at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee and a highlighter. The access logs showed a pattern. Every piece of evidence that subsequently disappeared or became compromised had been accessed in the 72 hours before its compromise by a single user credential, a high-level credential, one that belonged to a person with complete legitimate access to her case. She looked at the name for a long time. Marcus Hale, her mentor, the man who had given her the case, the man who had built her career, supervised her first prosecution, attended her father's funeral, and sat beside her in the front row, and told her that Alessia Vasquez had been one of the finest men he'd ever known. She put the highlighter down. She stared at the name. Her mind rejected it 3 times before the evidence made it stop. She requested an emergency document from the Federal Archive the next morning. Something obscure. Something Marcus would have no reason to know she was looking for. It was a 20-year-old internal review of a city official's financial dealings. Flagged, never fully investigated, quietly closed. Her father's name was in it. Not prominently. Not in a way that said guilt. But connected. A financial relationship with a private holding company that, if she traced the corporate lineage forward through 20 years of mergers and name changes, terminated at a company currently embedded in the Varela Group's supply chain structure. Her father, connected to Dominic's network. She sat in her car in the parking garage and did not move for 40 minutes. Then she called Dominic. He answered on the second ring. I found the file, she said. A pause. I know. My father. Yes. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of that. Tell me what you know about him. Not on the phone, he said. Tonight. I'll send you an address. She almost said no. She said, fine. They met in a penthouse office that looked out over the city like a command center. No team, no lawyers. Just the 2 of them and the skyline, and a truth she wasn't ready for. Alessia Vasquez worked with my organization, Dominic said. Not as an enforcer, not as a criminal. He was a city official who provided information, zoning decisions, contract awards, regulatory timelines, in exchange for what he believed was legitimate consulting compensation rooted through a shell company. She was standing very straight. Now, he knew what it was. He knew some of it. Dominic was careful. Honest, she realized. Genuinely trying to be accurate rather than strategic. He knew the money wasn't entirely clean. He told himself it was a gray area. He convinced himself the information he provided wasn't harmful. A pause. He may have been right that no direct harm came of it, but the connection existed. And if I continue this case, the defense will find it. My attorneys have already found it. I told them not to use it. He looked at her steadily. That was my decision. She turned away from him, faced the city. The lights blurred slightly, and she blinked them clear. She was not going to cry in front of this man. She was not going to cry at all. Why would you protect him? she said, her voice coming out thinner than she intended. Because it wouldn't help me. Sud, and because... He stopped. She heard him exhale slowly. Because whatever he was to you, destroying that is not something I want to be responsible for. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. Her father, the 3 Ps. Posture, preparation, purpose. The man who taught her that the law was the only honest thing left. The man who had taken gray area money from the same organization she was trying to dismantle. He's been dead for 4 years, she said quietly. I know. He can't explain himself. No. She turned around. Her face was composed. Whatever it cost her, she composed it. You've been protecting me. In ways. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his expression. Something she didn't have a name for because she'd never seen it on his face before. I'm not sure I can explain that in a way that doesn't sound like a line. Try. Because you're the most honest person I've encountered in a very long time, he said quietly. And I've spent my entire life in rooms where honesty is a liability. That's significant. To me. The silence between them was entirely different from the silences in the courtroom. This one had weight and heat, and she was very aware of standing 6 feet away from him and feeling like it was less than that. She looked away first again. She hated that she kept doing that. This changes the case, she said. Yes. I need to think. Take whatever time you need. She left. The elevator was silent, and the lobby was empty, and the city outside was all lights and rain, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold clear her head. It didn't really clear. She had 3 days of internal chaos that she packaged as focused case review. She slept 4 hours a night and ate when she remembered to, and sat with the fundamental question she'd been avoiding. What was she? If she continued the prosecution, her father's connection would eventually surface. She could try to contain it, but the defense would find a way. They always did. His reputation would be destroyed posthumously. Everything she'd built her identity on, justice, truth, the honest law, would be contaminated by the revelation that the man who taught it to her had made compromises she'd spent her career prosecuting others for. If she dropped the case, she was abandoning 9 years of work, allowing a criminal network to continue operating, and letting Marcus, whoever Marcus actually was, whatever Marcus was doing, win. She was building toward that third option, the one she couldn't quite see the shape of yet. And then the world stopped being theoretical. It started with an explosion. Varela Group's logistics hub on the eastern edge of the city caught fire on a Wednesday night. Not an accident, the fire marshal confirmed within hours, but a deliberate incendiary device. 2 of Dominic's senior operations managers were in the building when it happened. One escaped. One didn't. Alessia heard about it on the news at 11 p.m. and felt something drop in her stomach. By morning, there were 2 more incidents. A cyber attack on Varela's financial infrastructure that took 3 servers offline, and a car that had been following one of Dominic's attorneys had been found abandoned 3 blocks from the federal building. She went to her office and sat down and looked at her wall of evidence with completely different eyes. She pulled out her personal notebook. She looked at the access log patterns. She looked at the timeline of evidence compromise. She looked at the date Marcus had given her the case against Dominic. She went back further. She pulled public records, newspaper archives, a business journal piece from 8 years ago about a private equity consortium that had attempted a hostile leveraged acquisition of several Varela Group subsidiaries. The acquisition had failed. Dominic had outmaneuvered it legally and financially. The consortium had dissolved. Its principals had scattered. One of them had subsequently made a significant donation to Marcus Hale's campaign for a federal appointment. She read that 3 times. Now she opened her laptop and started pulling threads she should have pulled weeks ago. By 2 in the afternoon, she had it. Not all of it, not enough for a case, not yet, but enough to understand the architecture. Marcus had used her. He had given her the highest profile prosecution of her career, because it served as the perfect cover, a legitimate federal investigation into Dominic Varela that would distract, document, and dismantle his operations, while Marcus's real allies moved in from outside the legal system to take what they wanted. She was the vehicle. She was the distraction. She had walked into that courtroom armed with someone else's agenda and called it justice. The rage that moved through her was cold and very quiet and extremely focused. She picked up her phone. She was in her car in the parking garage, phone against her ear, when she heard the footsteps wrong. Later, she would not be able to articulate exactly what it was about the sound. Too deliberate, too measured, not the casual rhythm of someone heading to their car. She'd been in enough high-tension situations to have developed senses she didn't have names for. She got out of the car and moved. The man who'd been approaching from her left had a companion from her right. She had perhaps 3 seconds to understand this before a hand closed around her arm, and she drove her elbow backward as hard as she could, connected with something, spun, and then someone very large was between her and the second man, and she realized, in a disordered moment, that it was Dominic. He didn't look the way he looked in courtrooms. He looked like something older than a billionaire, something that had learned what it was doing in rooms she would never have access to. He handled the situation in 20 seconds with the efficient brutality of someone who had once, in some other life, been very different from the man in the charcoal suit. The parking garage went quiet. Dominic turned to look at her. He was breathing steadily. He had a cut above his left eye. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She was breathing hard. "How did you know?" "I've had eyes on you for 6 days," he said. "Since the warehouse fire." She looked at him. The question she'd been carrying for weeks, "Who are you, actually, beneath everything?" felt suddenly less abstract. "It was Marcus," she said. "Yes. He used me." "Yes." She looked at the 2 men on the concrete floor of the parking garage, then back at him. See everything she'd been trained to do. Call it in, document it, hand it to the appropriate authority, pressed against the recognition that the appropriate authority might be compromised, that Marcus had colleagues, that she didn't know yet how deep this went. She made a decision that 9 years ago Alessia would have been horrified by. "Tell me everything," she said. "All of it. Everything you know about Marcus, about the consortium, about who they are and what they want." He looked at her steadily. "If I do that, I know what it means for your case." "I know." She held his gaze. "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a car downstairs," he said finally. "A building I own, 3 blocks from here, that Marcus doesn't know about. We can talk there." She nodded once. They walked to the elevator together. His arm was close to hers. Neither of them moved away from that proximity, and neither of them commented on it. They talked for 4 hours. He was meticulous. He laid out what he knew about Marcus's consortium, who they were, what they wanted, how they'd been moving against his organization for 18 months before she'd ever been assigned the case. He showed her documents he'd never shown anyone, files his own attorneys hadn't seen, evidence of surveillance and interference that mapped cleanly onto the timeline she'd been building. She showed him her personal notebook, the access logs, the corporate lineage she'd traced back to the failed acquisition. They built the picture together at a table covered in files, and at some point the city outside the windows went from nighttime to pre-dawn, and neither of them had noticed. "You've been running a parallel investigation this whole time," he said, looking at her notebook. "I didn't know who to trust." "Do you know now?" She looked at him across the table. The cut above his eye had dried. He'd taken off his jacket somewhere around midnight. He looked, for the first time she could identify, like a person without armor. "I'm working on it," she said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across that courtroom, that private, evaluating look, except now it had something else in it that she felt in her chest, rather than just saw. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask. If none of this had happened, if there had been no Marcus, no conspiracy, no consortium, and you had built a clean case against me, a real one, Would you have won? She considered lying. She considered deflecting. She said, yes. He nodded slowly. I thought so. A pause. I'm glad it wasn't a clean case. She said nothing. Not because you were manipulated, he said carefully. Because it brought you to me, which is… He stopped himself. Which is what? She said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. Something I didn't anticipate, he said finally. Wanting someone to still be in the room when the case is over. The silence afterward had the particular quality of something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, and she sat with it and found, to her considerable surprise, that she didn't want to. There was one more meeting before everything changed. Marcus called her into his office 3 days later. A routine check-in, he said. She went with her notebook in her bag, and a recording device she'd obtained through a federal ally she'd quietly verified was not inside Marcus's circle. She sat across from him and watched his face while he performed concern, while he asked about her progress, while he suggested, gently, that perhaps the Varela case had become unwieldy, and that there might be merit in reviewing whether the current prosecution was the best path forward. She let him talk. Marcus, she said when he finished, I found the access logs. The performance stopped. I found the consortium connection. I found the donation. I found the failed acquisition. She held his gaze. She did not look away first. I know what you did. He was quiet for a very long time. Alessia. Don't. Her voice was quiet and absolutely final. I learned everything I know about the law from you. You told me it was the last honest thing. You said that to me at my father's funeral. She paused. Was any of it true? He had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. Some things can be true, he said slowly, and still not be the whole picture. No, she said. She stood. No, Marcus. That's not how it works. She left his office for the last time. Dominic found her that evening on the roof garden of the building where they'd spent the 4-hour night. She'd been there for an hour, looking at the city, not particularly thinking anything coherent. She heard him come through the door. She didn't turn. He stood beside her. Below them, the city moved through its night rhythms, indifferent and continuous. You confronted him, he said. Yes. That was probably not tactically optimal, she said. I know. He almost smiled. She heard it in his voice when he said, I was going to say brave. She looked at him then. He was watching the city the same way she had been, and she thought about how strange it was to be standing next to someone she had spent months trying to dismantle, feeling safer than she had in months. What happens now? She said. Now we build a real case. Against Marcus. Against the consortium. Against everyone who used your courtroom as a weapon. He turned to face her. I have resources you don't have access to through legitimate channels. You have legitimacy I haven't had access to in 20 years. Together. Together, we're a conflict of interest, she said. Together, we're the only people who understand the full picture, he countered. She looked at him. The full picture. Her father's complicated ghost, her compromised case, her mentor's betrayal. This man in front of her, who was not the monster she'd prosecuted, and not a saint either. And somewhere in that complicated truth was something she'd stopped being able to categorize. You wanted to destroy me, he said quietly. An echo of a conversation she could feel coming. Something that had been building since a courtroom 3 months ago, when he'd smiled at her, like he knew something she didn't. She looked at him. Now help me destroy them. The city breathed below them. She thought about her father, who had made compromises and still believed in justice, who had been human and flawed, and still the man who raised her. She thought about Marcus, who had used every principle she believed in as cover for something she'd never forgive. She thought about 9 years of certainty, and how certainty, it turned out, was just preparation that hadn't met the right complication yet. She thought about standing in this exact spot at 4 in the morning, with files between them, and the strange, undeniable feeling of being known by someone who had started as her enemy. She thought about the fact that she was going to say yes, and that she was not afraid of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. And the war, the real one, the one that mattered, had only just begun. The prosecutor who tried to put him in prison just became his strongest ally. But what happens when love grows between enemies? In the middle of a war? If you made it this far, you already know the answer is complicated. Drop in the comments what you would do in Alessia's position. Would you trust him? Would you walk away? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want to see where this goes next. The next chapter of this story is going to change everything you think you know about both of them. Hit that subscribe button. The story is just getting started.